Ivan Birrer, who is 91 years old, was in graduate school working on his doctorate in psychology during World War II when he was required to register for the draft, which was to be for the duration of 1 year. When he registered, he found he was going to be called to active duty quickly. He decided to go to the draft board and asked if he could be sent out on the next levy.
And I was inducted into the Army in August of 1941.
Soon after Burr was inducted, he found out the following.
The first thing that happened of any consequence was that by a vote of one, majority of one, in the House of Representatives, the United States Congress changed the rules, and all people drafted were not in for 1 year, but in for the duration plus 6.
He was sent to a reception center in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. There he took an Army General Classification test, which was similar to an intelligence test. After taking the test, he was interviewed for a military occupational specialty.
The reception center had been advised to keep their eyes open for anybody who qualified for the MOS, that's Military Occupational Specialty, 289, psychologist. And then if they got any of those, don't send them out regularly, just hold on for it and report. And that's what happened in my interview. And it turned out that really there were some 6 of us throughout the Midwest area about the same time.
They were all sent to Fort Riley, Kansas for basic training at a cavalry replacement training center. After their basic training, they remained there until receiving their assignment instructions.
And the assignment instructions were keep them there and use them in the classification office until you get further notice. So now we're talking about the end of the year, I suppose. Another few months went by, and all of us received orders to report to the Adjutant General's Officer Candidate School at Fort Washington, Maryland.
The course ended on September 19, 1942. He was then promoted to second lieutenant.
After I got the commission as a second lieutenant, my first real assignment was to what was called an Army Administration School at Huntsville, Texas. The Army then had taken over most of the college that was there. It's now called Sam Houston State University. And we're running a school where enlisted men were taught how to be company clerks and that sort of thing. And I was there about 11 months or so.
Burr was transferred from Huntsville, Texas to Monticello, Arkansas. A year later, the colonel he worked under was moved to North Camp Hood, Texas, where new disciplinary barracks were being opened because the ones at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas were becoming overpopulated. He decided to bring Burr with him.
We began to get carloads of inmates shipped down from Leavenworth. I remember we went from 0 inmates to 1,000 overnight.
While working at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, mainly doing clerical work thus far, he came across an opportunity to go to Command and General Staff School.
And here was a flyer put out from the War Department inviting officers to apply to attend the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where they learned how to run the big units. And all the major people that you knew about, Eisenhower, Arthur, Patton, I could go down They're all Leavenworth graduates.
After the course at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas ended, he was given orders to go to the Army Forces Western Pacific headquarters in Manila.
I steamed out of San Francisco on a troop ship, and I was assigned to the headquarters of what was called Army Forces Western Pacific. And this is the headquarters that was organized to stage the Japanese invasion. 3 days out, the atomic bomb was dropped over Hiroshima. And what was it, 5 days later, the other one, 3 days later?
Since the bombs were dropped, Birrer ended up being sent to Los Baños in the Philippine Islands doing the same job that he had done at Fort Leavenworth. It was here that he had his most memorable experience of the war.
Shortly after I got to Manila, they were having the series of trials of Japanese generals. Actually, two. Yamashita, who commanded the forces that first took the Philippines, and Homma, Homma, who was the one that actually seized command and captured Corregidor. In due time, Homma was tried. Commission found him guilty of perpetuating inhumane activities and so forth, and sentenced him to be executed, shot to death with musketry.
After receiving Homma's verdict, Birrer's camp found out they would be responsible for Homma's execution.
And then one day, we got official word from the base headquarters in Manila, that was our commanding officer, that the execution of Homma would be held at our place. And my job was to read to him the order. Ordinarily, a court-martial order is a very straightforward document. That's what I expected to have. But what I got was 2 documents, single-spaced, complete typewritten. And now the setting. So I walk over there, and I have 2 great big, well-armed, burly sergeants with me. And we walk into this place, and sitting on the divan was this man. Actually, probably the biggest Japanese I'd ever seen. I said, General Homma, I'm Captain Birrer, and it's my responsibility to read to you this order. Well, I started reading this and went down through there. And the first half of it was a recitation of all these dastardly deeds that had been performed by his people. And through all this, he just sat there, about like this. So the second page then became a review of his military record. And it was written in such a way as to not only infer, but explicitly to conclude that he wasn't qualified to command in anything anyway. And when I got to this part, suddenly he stood up and he said, Captain, you're shooting me tonight because we lost the war. And then he sat down. I had to say, and it's my duty to advise you that the sentence will be executed at 2 o'clock this morning.
After Homma's execution, Birrer went back to his office to complete the required paperwork that went with this process.
Well, I might tell you that I filled out the form, which was when the shots were fired. When he was pronounced dead, the medical officer told me what time, when the shots were fired. And I gave it to the courier, and he said, "Now, Captain, one more thing. I have orders from you, and these come directly from General MacArthur. You are not to write or ever talk about what you saw and what you did tonight." I was a young major, and I took this pretty seriously. And I complied with the rule. I never told anybody the story. I walked up to from our summer place in Texas. I walked up to the office to get the mail, and the mail included a copy of a magazine called American History. And I'm walking back, and I look, and here's a picture of General Hama. And I thought to myself, well, okay, all bets are now off. And so I sat down and immediately wrote a column to this magazine. I said sequel to the Hama story, and I told him the rest of the story, the one that I just told you about.
After Birrer completed his story about Hama, he continued into another of his memorable experiences during the war, which occurred while he was working at the Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Hood, Texas.
This occurred at Camp Hood, Texas. Camp Hood is about 30 miles square. And as you go, today the main post is on the south side, south end. And there's a training facility clear at the north end. But it was at the north end where we had this prisoner of war camp. This disciplinary barracks. Well, we didn't have much security. It was a barbed wire fence. We had a lot of fog and mist there, and we kept getting people we kept getting escapes. And the colonel got very angry about this. There was in the little town nearby, Gageville, Texas, there's a reform school or something like that. And they had some dogs that they trained to be trackers. So, in due time, we had 3 escape one night. And we called, and they brought the dogs out, and they had some clothing they could smell and so forth. And they turned the dogs loose, and the dogs took off to the south as well. Now, in between, there's nothing. It was a training area. About a week went by, and my phone rang, and I said, "Captain Birrer," and he said, and the caller identified himself as a first sergeant of a unit at South Camp. And he said, "Captain, we got 3 guys walk in there, and they tell us that they have escapees from your prison. Are you sure of 3 guys?" I said, "Well, we sure are." He said, "Oh yes," and he said, "There's a couple of dogs with them." So we arranged to go send a truck down and pick them all up. Then, of course, what we found out was that the dogs had caught them all right, but they'd made friends with the dogs. But they're out there, and they found themselves hunkered down where these people were firing artillery shells. And man, they couldn't get back home quickly enough. And it was closer to go that way than to come back north.
Birrer then went on to describe his journey home after being discharged from duty.
I can tell you that the troop train took 4 days to go from San Francisco to Leavenworth, Kansas, which is right by Kansas City, because it had every other piece of railroad transport had priority, and we just went on like this.
Once he returned home, he finished obtaining his Ph.D. in psychology. He was then asked to be a civilian psychologist for the Army Command General Staff College, which is what he continued to do until he retired. Birrer now goes on to describe how he feels about his experience in the Army.
You see, I know most everybody you talk to have had combat experience, and that's a whole other situation. But a large percentage of us put the uniform on, did what we were told, tried to do a good job, never saw a shot fired in anger. And it wasn't our fault. That's just the way it worked out. And I'm one of those guys. How do I feel then about service? I had a great experience. I had 29, as a 29-year-old, I had authority way beyond my kin. But that was pretty typical of most of us in those days. But I wouldn't exchange for it. And I'm very proud of my service, and I have a great feeling for the Army.
When asked if he is proud of his experience in the Army, he replied by saying the following.
If I had to do it all over again, I guess I would like to think I've done it just as well as I did it this time.
We would like to thank Dr. Ivan Birrer for presenting us with the opportunity to interview him. Hearing his personal experiences from World War II allowed us the chance to learn about the war from someone who took part in it. In doing so, we were able to learn a great deal more than if we had read about the war from our textbook in class. While listening to Dr. Birrer's stories, in a way we were able to relive the experiences with him, which made the opportunity especially rewarding. This experience showed us that you didn't have to participate in battle to be a hero in World War II. After doing this project, we now have a greater respect for all of the participants in the war. By entering into the armed forces, these men were essentially putting their lives on the line for our country. These men showed not only great courage, but also great selflessness. We would like to take this opportunity to thank all of those who served our country, because every one of them helped shape it into the great nation it is today.